She deserves more than you. Those 4 words slipped from my mother's lips one summer evening in 2018, and I swear they split my heart into 2. I was standing in the driveway, my diploma still warm in my hand, my cheeks flushed with the hope of finally being seen. For years, my father had promised me that when I finished college, the old Mustang, his prized vintage car, would be mine. It wasn't just about the car. It was about recognition, about the promise that I, Lauren Mitchell, would finally matter. But as my sister Rachel jingled the keys with a grin that didn't even seem to fit her face, I felt something inside me collapse. That night, my life as I knew it changed forever. I had loved that car since I was 14. Every time my dad pulled into the driveway, I would sneak into the garage and sit behind the wheel, my fingers barely reaching over the polished steering wheel. I imagined the roads I'd drive, the freedom it would give me, the validation it carried. To me, the Mustang wasn't just metal and leather. It was a promise etched into my future, a reward for the years I felt invisible in my own home. My father had looked me in the eye once and said, "When you graduate, this will be yours, kiddo." I believed him because, despite his flaws, my dad didn't make empty promises, or so I thought. Rachel stood there, her hair perfectly curled, her dress spotless as if she had stepped out of a magazine cover, holding the keys that were supposed to be mine. She didn't even like cars, never cared about engines or models or the rush of open roads, but she had always been the golden child, the one who never had to try too hard. My parents said it was because she was younger, because she needed more support, but we both knew the truth. Rachel was their star, and I was the shadow they never acknowledged. That afternoon, while neighbors congratulated my parents for raising 2 successful daughters, I could feel myself fading from the picture entirely. The betrayal cut deeper because I had worked so hard for their approval. I stayed up endless nights studying while Rachel skipped through school, carried by her charm. I took jobs to help pay for my tuition, never once asking for help, while Rachel's every whim was funded without question. And yet, when it came time to show who had earned that car, who had deserved that symbolic acknowledgement of effort and endurance, the keys landed in her hand. The air that day was heavy with barbecue smoke and clinking glasses, but for me, it smelled only of ash, of something burned beyond repair. When my mother said those words, "She deserves more than you," I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I just stared at her, trying to memorize the way her lips curled when she said them, as if my pain was nothing more than a lesson I needed to learn. My father avoided my eyes, sipping his beer, pretending not to notice how my entire world was unraveling. Rachel, for her part, looked uncomfortable, though not enough to hand back the keys. It was in that silence, that suffocating silence between their laughter and my breaking heart, that I understood. I would never be enough for them. Not then, not ever. That night, while the rest of the family sat around the table, I locked myself in my room and stared at the ceiling until the tears blurred everything into white. The car wasn't what hurt me the most. It was the message it carried. That no matter how hard I worked, no matter how many times I tried to prove myself, I would always be second to Rachel. That my dreams could be bought and sold at their convenience. And in that moment, I made a vow to myself, one that burned hotter than any heartbreak could. One day, they would regret underestimating me. One day, they would choke on those words they had thrown at me so carelessly. Growing up with Rachel was like living in someone else's shadow, even in my own home. I was 3 years older, but age didn't matter. Rachel was always the center of attention. She had this effortless way of walking into a room and bending the air to her will. Teachers adored her, neighbors complimented her, and my parents practically worshipped her. I, on the other hand, was the one who just needed to work harder, the one whose victories seemed to evaporate the moment Rachel opened her mouth. It wasn't that she was cruel, not yet, but she didn't need to be. Her very existence was enough to eclipse mine. I remember birthdays most vividly. Mine were always practical affairs. A store-bought cake, a couple of close friends, and a polite but rushed family dinner. Rachel's birthdays, though, were events. Balloons tied across the yard, a guest list that stretched beyond the neighborhood, gifts stacked so high they nearly touched the table's edge. When I once asked my mother why Rachel's celebrations were always bigger, she smiled thinly and said, "She's younger, Lauren. She needs to feel special." I never asked again, but the question stayed with me like a thorn, digging deeper each year as the difference became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the celebrations, it was the daily affirmations. Rachel could stumble through half-hearted homework and still be praised for her effort. I could score straight A's, yet all my father would say was, "Good job, kiddo. Now don't slack off." That subtle dismissal cut sharper than any insult could have. Rachel didn't even want the things I dreamed of. She wanted attention, glamour, and easy roads. But when it came to my passion, whether it was the Mustang, my art projects, or even my college acceptance letter, somehow she ended up standing in the spotlight while I was left clapping politely in the dark. Despite the favoritism, I still tried to be the good sister. I drove her to school when she overslept, helped her with essays when she couldn't focus, even lent her money from my own part-time jobs when she needed it. I thought maybe, just maybe, if I kept giving, she would see me, not just as a backup, but as her sister. Sometimes she did thank me, with a quick hug or a smile, and those crumbs of affection were enough to keep me hopeful. But deep down, I knew she didn't carry the same weight I did. She never had to fight for approval, never had to prove her worth. Life bent for her, while I broke myself trying to keep up. The Mustang had always been my sanctuary. While Rachel spent her weekends at parties, I spent mine in the garage with Dad, handing him tools, learning the names of every part, memorizing how the engine hummed when it was healthy. It was ours, or at least that's what I thought. My father would tell me stories of his youth, of how he bought the car with his first paycheck, and swore he'd pass it on to his eldest child. I clung to those words like gospel. They were a lifeline, proof that maybe I wasn't as invisible as I felt. But then Rachel turned her smile on that car, casually saying one day, "It's cute." I could totally see myself driving it. From that moment on, I felt the ground begin to shift beneath me. Looking back, it was never just about the car. It was about the pattern, the constant reinforcement that Rachel deserved more simply because she was Rachel. My parents fed into it willingly, as if they were too blinded by her shine to see how much I was dimming in the background. But I didn't let go of my dream. Not yet. I believed there had to be a breaking point, a moment when my sacrifices, my diligence, would finally outshine her easy charm. What I didn't know then was that the breaking point was coming, and when it arrived, it wouldn't just shatter my illusions. It would shatter the foundation of our family. The day of my college graduation should have been one of the happiest of my life, the culmination of years of sleepless nights, long study sessions, and sacrifices no one but me truly understood. I had imagined it countless times, my parents in the crowd, beaming with pride as my name was called, Rachel clapping with genuine excitement, Dad telling me afterward that the Mustang was finally mine, a symbol of all I had earned. Instead, reality struck with a cruel twist. As I stood there in my cap and gown, heart pounding, I noticed the empty seats where my family should have been. They had promised, sworn, they would be there. But all I saw was a vacant space, as though my achievements weren't worth their time. I tried to ignore the ache in my chest, convincing myself maybe they had been delayed, maybe they would show up late. But as name after name was called, and the ceremony drew to a close, the truth became undeniable. They hadn't come. When my name echoed across the stage, I walked across the platform with a forced smile, clutching my diploma like a lifeline, while inside I felt hollow. Strangers clapped politely, but the one sound I longed for, the applause of my family, was missing. My classmates celebrated with their parents, hugging them, taking pictures, while I stood alone, the air thick with shame and betrayal. Afterward, when I checked my phone, I found a single message from Rachel. "Congrats. Sorry we couldn't make it. Something came up. Something came up." That was the excuse for missing one of the most important days of my life. Rage burned in me, but I swallowed it, telling myself I'd confront them later. I drove home still wearing my gown, the silence in the car louder than any storm. My diploma sat on the passenger seat, a fragile piece of paper that suddenly felt meaningless without the validation I had been chasing for years. When I finally walked through the front door, I found them all gathered in the living room. Laughter filled the air, and there, in the middle of it, was Rachel, holding the keys to my Mustang. My parents were clapping, toasting, celebrating her. My heart stopped as I watched Rachel jingle the keys, her face lit with triumph, while Dad announced, "We thought Rachel deserved this. She's worked so hard too, and it's time she had a car of her own." The betrayal cut deeper than anything I had ever felt. They hadn't just missed my graduation. They had stolen the very thing that symbolized my bond with Dad, the one promise I thought would never be broken. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. My gown still hung around me, and the irony was unbearable. I had just walked across a stage to prove my worth, only to come home and be reminded I would never be enough in their eyes. Rachel caught my gaze and smiled, not with malice, but with that same effortless charm she always wielded. Maybe she didn't realize the magnitude of what she had taken, or maybe she did. Either way, she twirled the keys around her finger and said lightly, "Don't worry, Lauren. You'll get your turn someday." Her words rang in my ears like a curse. That was the moment something shifted in me. The weight of years of being overlooked, dismissed, overshadowed, all of it hardened into something sharp and unyielding. I realized then that I would never receive what I deserved by waiting, by hoping they would see me. If I wanted justice, if I wanted to reclaim what was mine, I would have to take it. And as I stood there, humiliated in my graduation gown, while my sister posed with the car of my dreams, I silently made a vow. They would regret underestimating me, every single one of them. That night I couldn't sleep. The house was still buzzing with the echo of laughter, Rachel's voice carrying into my room as she called friends to brag about her new Mustang. I lay on my bed staring at the ceiling, my graduation gown crumpled in the corner like a discarded dream. My diploma, the one thing I had fought tooth and nail for, leaned against the wall as if mocking me. My chest tightened with a pain that was heavier than grief. It was betrayal. Betrayal by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. I realized I wasn't mourning the car alone. I was mourning the years of loyalty I had given to a family that treated me as second best. In the silence, my thoughts raced. I replayed every sacrifice, every late night where I stayed home studying while Rachel went out, every time I accepted scraps of attention while she basked in the spotlight. I had been taught to endure, to be patient, to believe that one day my moment would come. But that night, clarity cut through me like lightning. Patience was just another word for surrender, and I was done surrendering. I decided I would no longer beg for their approval, no longer wait for them to recognize my worth. If they had chosen to give my car, my dream, to Rachel, then I would choose something else. Power. The next morning, I put on a mask. I smiled at breakfast, congratulated Rachel again, even asked her how the car handled. She smirked, proud as ever, but too self-absorbed to notice the quiet fire burning behind my eyes. Mom commented on how mature I was being, and Dad nodded, as if relieved I wasn't throwing a tantrum. Let them think I had accepted it. Let them believe I was still the quiet, dutiful daughter who never fought back. In reality, every moment I spent sitting across from them, sipping my coffee, was another moment spent sharpening my resolve. It was during that breakfast that I noticed the small cracks I had never seen before. Dad's eyes looked tired, and when Mom reached for her cup, her hands trembled slightly. Rachel, in her excitement, dominated the table, leaving their attention fixed on her, but I watched the details they all ignored. Dad complained about bills, about how expensive everything had become. Mom worried about their savings running out faster than expected. They weren't as secure as they pretended. That realization planted a seed in me, an opportunity I hadn't considered before. If I couldn't have their affection, I would learn to use their weaknesses instead. Over the next weeks, I played my part perfectly. I cheered Rachel on when she flaunted the Mustang, asked Mom about recipes, even offered to help Dad sort through old paperwork. Behind the mask, I was studying them, memorizing patterns, finding vulnerabilities. I saw the way Rachel flaunted her recklessness, filling the gas tank with money she didn't earn, parking the car in dangerous places, thinking nothing could touch her. I noticed how Dad kept old files in his desk drawer, folders labeled with insurance policies, loans, and property deeds. And I realized for the first time that power didn't always come in the form of approval or gifts. It came from knowledge, and I was quietly gathering mine. One evening, as Rachel came home late and tossed the keys carelessly onto the counter, I picked them up and held them in my hand. My reflection stared back at me in the chrome keychain, distorted but resolute. I could have taken the car right then, driven it until the tank ran dry, but that would have been too small, too impulsive. No, what I wanted wasn't just the Mustang. I wanted to take back everything they had stolen from me. I wanted them to see me not as the forgotten daughter, but as the one who could dismantle everything they thought was untouchable. That night, I placed the keys back exactly where she had left them and whispered to myself, "This is just the beginning. The first step in any war is to know your battlefield," and mine began in my father's study. It wasn't hard to slip in when no one was paying attention. Rachel was always out parading the car, and Mom was busy with her endless chores. Dad rarely locked anything, Perhaps he still believed in the illusion of trust within our family. I sat at his old wooden desk, my heart pounding as I opened the drawers. At first, it was mundane. Tax receipts, utility bills, old letters. But then I found the bottom drawer, heavier than the rest, with a stack of manila folders that smelled faintly of dust and ink. My hands trembled as I pulled one free. Inside were documents I wasn't supposed to see. Loan applications, a mortgage extension, credit card bills far higher than I imagined my parents could owe. At the top of one folder was a bold red stamp, past due. My father's neat signature scrawled across desperate agreements revealed what he'd never admitted at the dinner table. Our family was drowning in debt. Suddenly, the cracks I had seen before weren't just cracks. They were fractures threatening to shatter everything. My chest tightened, not from sympathy, but from the sharp taste of possibility. They weren't untouchable anymore. They were vulnerable. The more I read, the deeper my understanding grew. The car, the Mustang that had been meant for me, wasn't simply a gift. It had been an indulgence they couldn't afford. Selling it to Rachel wasn't generosity. It was a desperate attempt to cover up their favoritism while holding on to a facade of stability. My sister drove around flaunting a car bought with money my parents didn't even have, while I studied quietly, never knowing the walls around me were built on financial lies. Rage bubbled inside me, but with it came a twisted kind of relief. For once, I wasn't the weak one. For once, I had leverage. I gathered the folders carefully, making sure to memorize details without leaving evidence of my snooping. Dates, amounts, banks. Every line was etched into my mind like ammunition for a war I was only beginning to fight. I thought about confronting them right away, slamming the papers on the dinner table and watching their faces crumble. But no, that wasn't the right move. If there was one thing my years of silence had taught me, it was the power of timing. Instead, I slid everything back into place, closed the drawer, and walked out of that study with a secret my parents didn't know I carried. That night, when Rachel breezed through the front door with her hair windblown and the sound of the Mustang still echoing in the driveway, I watched her differently. She wasn't just my sister anymore. She was a pawn in a much larger game. She reveled in her supposed victory, in having what was mine, but she had no idea how fragile her world really was. Our parents had handed her the keys to a car that might one day become her greatest burden, especially when I decided to reveal the truth about where that money came from. She laughed loudly at her own jokes while Mom doted on her, and I sat there silently, holding the weight of knowledge like a weapon beneath the table. As I lay in bed, staring into the darkness, I thought about the word family. Once it had meant safety, warmth, and unconditional love. Now it was a word coated in ash, a hollow echo of what I once believed. My parents' betrayal had burned away whatever innocence I had left, but in its place grew something sharper. I made a silent vow that night, a promise etched deep into my bones. I would no longer beg to belong. I would no longer be the quiet shadow. If they saw me as second best, I would show them what it meant to underestimate me. And when the time came, I wouldn't just take back what was mine, I would make them regret ever giving it away. I woke the next morning with a strange calmness, as if my anger had settled into a steady current running beneath my skin. It was no longer the wild, flaring fire of betrayal, but something more controlled, like a storm biding its time. At breakfast, Mom was fussing over Rachel's schedule again, reminding her about oil changes and insurance for the Mustang. I sipped my coffee quietly, masking the satisfaction I felt knowing how precarious everything truly was. Every word my mother spoke about responsibility sounded like a mockery when I pictured those overdue bills hidden in my father's desk. And yet, no one at that table knew I was the only one with the truth. The first move had to be subtle. I wasn't about to storm in and declare war. That would only make them defensive, push them to close ranks, and maybe even hide their secrets more carefully. Instead, I tested the waters. That afternoon, I casually mentioned to Rachel how expensive Mustangs could be to maintain, especially when money wasn't exactly abundant in our household. She rolled her eyes, brushing me off with her usual arrogance, but I didn't miss the flicker of doubt in her expression. A seed had been planted, and seeds, when watered with the right words, had a way of growing. Later that week, I visited the local bank under the pretense of running errands for school. I didn't need access to my parents' accounts. All I needed was information, a polite conversation with the teller, a few carefully phrased questions, and I walked away with confirmation that the Carter family wasn't as financially stable as Rachel loved to believe. To me, it was like finding cracks in a dam. and all I had to do was wait for the flood. I tucked this knowledge away, rehearsing scenarios in my head where I could twist it to my advantage. Each one felt like sharpening a blade, waiting for the right time to strike. At home, I played the role of the dutiful daughter, the invisible one. I did my chores, I kept my grades up, and I stayed out of arguments. To them, it must have looked like resignation, as though I had finally accepted my place in Rachel's shadow. But inside, I was learning the rhythm of their routines, memorizing their weaknesses. My father, distracted and weary, spent longer hours locked in his study, perhaps trying to juggle the crumbling finances. My mother, blind in her favoritism, was too busy managing Rachel's triumphs to notice how quiet I had become. And Rachel, spoiled and careless, flaunted the car around town as though she were untouchable. None of them saw me coming. The first deliberate crack I made came one evening at dinner. Rachel was bragging about a minor victory, something about impressing her friends with the Mustang's engine roar. When I leaned in and with careful softness said, "It's funny, isn't it? How fragile appearances can be. One moment you're on top, and the next, everything falls apart." My parents looked up in mild confusion. Rachel scowled, but I smiled sweetly as if I'd said nothing unusual. It was enough to make Rachel snap, accusing me of being jealous, which only proved my point further. I excused myself calmly, leaving them unsettled, the taste of my words lingering in the room like smoke. That night, lying in bed, I felt the thrill of it, the power of holding a truth no one else knew, the way a single sentence could ripple through their carefully constructed reality. It was intoxicating, but it also terrified me. Was I becoming something darker than I ever intended? Or was this simply the birth of the version of myself I should have always been? Strong, unyielding, unwilling to be dismissed. Whatever the answer, I knew one thing with certainty. I was no longer waiting for them to regret their choices. I was creating the circumstances that would force them to. And this was only the beginning. The following week, I began to notice the first visible fractures in my parents' perfect facade. Rachel, once so smug behind the wheel of the Mustang, had grown unusually irritable. She snapped at Mom for asking her to run simple errands and came home late, often slamming doors behind her. I knew the cause. Whispers from her so-called friends. I had let it slip to one of them at the diner that Rachel was driving a car her parents could barely afford. A car they had sacrificed far more for than anyone realized. Rumors spread like wildfire in our small town, and Rachel hated nothing more than being exposed as less than perfect. At dinner, the tension crackled like static. Mom kept asking Rachel why she seemed distracted, but Rachel deflected with sharp retorts. My father barely touched his food, staring at his plate as if the numbers in his head had followed him out of the study. I chewed slowly, listening, almost savoring the silence that grew between them. For the first time, I wasn't the target of criticism, wasn't the disappointment at the table. The spotlight had shifted, and though guilt brushed against my chest like a fleeting shadow, the satisfaction was stronger. One night, while Rachel stormed off to her room, I lingered near Dad's study. Through the cracked door, I caught the faint sound of his voice, low, desperate, arguing with someone on the phone. The words loan, deadline, and can't keep this up slid into the hallway like poisoned smoke. My stomach tightened, not with fear, but with the confirmation of what I already suspected. The Mustang wasn't just a gift. It was a weight dragging the family into deeper financial ruin. And Rachel, in all her ignorance, had no idea. My father's sigh, heavy and defeated, was the sound of a man who knew the truth was catching up to him. The next morning, I tested the waters further. Over breakfast, I asked innocently, "Dad, is everything okay at work? You seem tired." He froze, spoon halfway to his mouth, and gave me a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Everything's fine, sweetheart," he lied, but his voice cracked on the last word. Mom shot me a quick glare, as though I had crossed a line by daring to acknowledge the cracks. Rachel, too self-absorbed, didn't even notice. I let it drop, pretending to believe him, but inside, I was already calculating how this secret could become my sharpest weapon yet. That afternoon, Rachel cornered me in the hallway, her eyes blazing. "What are you doing, Lauren?" she hissed. "Talking about Dad at breakfast like that? You're trying to embarrass us." I tilted my head, feigning innocence, and replied, "I was just worried. You know, some of us actually pay attention to what's happening." The fury in her eyes was delicious, because beneath it was fear. For the first time, Rachel realized she wasn't in full control of the narrative, and I realized just how much she hated being seen as vulnerable. That knowledge was power I intended to use. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my thoughts racing. I wasn't just reacting anymore, I was orchestrating. Each move, each word, was like a stone tossed into a still pond, sending ripples that disturbed the surface of their carefully maintained lies. But with each step, I also felt the weight of becoming someone I barely recognized. Was I punishing them, or was I teaching them? Was this vengeance, or justice? The questions swirled, but one truth remained steady in my chest. I wasn't powerless anymore. For the first time in my life, I held the strings, and soon, I would pull them tighter. It happened on a gray Saturday morning, when Rachel had stormed out after another argument with Mom. I had grown used to her leaving her things scattered around the house, as though every room belonged to her. That day, her purse sat abandoned on the couch, spilling lipstick and receipts like breadcrumbs. Normally, I wouldn't have dared touch it, but something tugged at me, a whisper that maybe inside there was proof of who she really was. I slipped my hand inside and felt paper, folded, hidden carefully between notebooks. When I pulled it out, my heart lurched. It was a letter, addressed not to her, but to my father. The handwriting was Rachel's, unmistakably neat and bold, yet the words inside felt like knives. She wrote about how she deserved everything more than I ever would. She wrote that she had convinced our parents to sell the Mustang to her because I was too weak to handle such responsibility. Worst of all, she ended with a line that turned my blood cold. One day she'll leave like always, and when she does, we won't miss her. My throat tightened, my fingers trembling as I read those words over and over. They weren't careless insults. They were her truth. She had already written me out of the family story. I sat there, letter clutched in my hands, unable to breathe. Suddenly, all the snide remarks, all the favoritism, all the dismissive laughter at my expense crystallized into one undeniable reality. Rachel wanted me erased, and she wasn't just whispering it in private. She was planting it in Dad's heart, feeding him reasons to see me as disposable. My own sister, the person who shared my blood, had been poisoning the well against me. The betrayal was so sharp it was almost physical, like being pushed down a flight of stairs by someone you once trusted to hold your hand. When Rachel returned later that day, humming as though nothing had happened, I forced myself to act normal. I tucked the letter back exactly where I found it, my hands steady, despite the storm inside me. She would never suspect I had seen it, and that secrecy became my weapon. Because now I knew her truest face. Not the perfect daughter, not the golden girl, but a manipulator, a saboteur who thrived on my pain. If she thought she could write me out of existence, then she had gravely underestimated me. I was done playing the role of her shadow. That evening, while Mom cooked and Dad lingered in his study, I sat in my room, planning. The letter had opened a new door in my mind. If Rachel was so confident in her control over them, then exposing her lies would shatter that confidence. I wanted them to see, with their own eyes, who she really was. I imagined Mom's expression when she realized her favorite daughter had been tearing the family apart. I imagined Dad's silence turning to shame, and I imagined Rachel's mask crumbling under the weight of her own words. For the first time, my revenge wasn't about the car anymore. It was about reclaiming my place. Lying awake that night, I thought about all the years I had begged for their approval, swallowed their neglect, and tried to be grateful for scraps of attention. But the letter showed me the truth. Rachel had been playing this game long before the Mustang. Maybe my parents had let themselves be blinded. Maybe they wanted to believe she was perfect. But deep down, I knew they'd have to face the reality. And when that day came, I wouldn't just be the forgotten daughter anymore. I would be the one holding the evidence, the one they had underestimated until it was far too late. The next morning, the letter still burned in my memory like a brand I couldn't erase. I decided then that Rachel wouldn't know I had it. Not yet. If I confronted her, she would twist everything, play the victim, and once again charm Mom and Dad into siding with her. No, I needed a quieter approach, one that let them see the truth with their own eyes. The key wasn't to scream about her betrayal, it was to let her reveal herself, and I would simply light the stage for her to perform on. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Dad asked Rachel to help with a small repair in the garage, and she rolled her eyes, complaining that she was too important to waste time on things like that. I was nearby, quietly organizing boxes, pretending not to hear. When Dad frowned at her dismissive tone, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. He wasn't used to hearing her speak that way. It was usually reserved for me. That was the first crack in her golden mask, and I knew more would come. All I had to do was be patient. Over the next week, I began nudging things into place. Whenever Rachel snapped at me, I made sure to stay calm, lowering my voice so our parents could hear the contrast between us. I let her impatience bloom in front of them, while I played the role of the steady one, the daughter they had overlooked for so long. Sometimes it was as simple as asking for help with the dishes, while she scrolled through her phone, ignoring Mom's sighs. Other times, it meant answering Dad's questions thoughtfully, while Rachel interrupted with careless remarks. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, their eyes began to shift. But I knew words weren't enough. I needed something undeniable, something that would leave no room for excuses. That was when I thought of the letter again. It wasn't just evidence. It was a weapon. Still, I couldn't reveal it outright. If I did, Rachel would accuse me of snooping, and the focus would turn back on me. Instead, I began leaving breadcrumbs. I asked Mom once, casually, "Do you think Rachel ever feels like she deserves more than me?" The look on Mom's face, confused and unsettled, told me the seed had been planted. Rachel, of course, was oblivious to the shift. She carried herself with the same arrogance, laughing louder at the dinner table, boasting about her grades, tossing her hair like she was starring in some invisible spotlight. But now, I noticed the way Dad sometimes frowned at her tone, the way Mom hesitated before praising her too quickly. It was subtle, almost fragile, but it was there. For the first time in years, the pedestal Rachel stood on began to wobble, and every careless word she spoke made it shake harder. One night, as I lay in bed, I realized something both thrilling and terrifying. I wasn't just waiting for Rachel to fall, I was pushing her, carefully, invisibly, and I liked it. The power wasn't in shouting or demanding, it was in patience, in strategy, in letting the truth slip through the cracks. She had tried to erase me, to write me out of the family story, but I wasn't gone. I was right here, weaving a new ending, one where the golden child finally paid the price for her lies. And soon, they would all see her the way I did. By the time Rachel noticed the change, it was already too late. She began second-guessing herself, replaying every word she said at the dinner table, every dismissive glance she had thrown my way. I watched her from the kitchen doorway one afternoon as she fumed over an innocuous comment I had made about responsibility. Her fingers tapped nervously against the counter, her jaw clenched, and for the first time, she looked small, not the invincible, untouchable sister she always pretended to be. I felt a thrill of satisfaction, tempered by a trace of guilt I quickly shoved aside. The next morning, Rachel's paranoia was impossible to miss. She questioned Mom about what I had said the night before, asked Dad if he had noticed my attitude. Both tried to placate her, but the uncertainty in their expressions betrayed them. I sipped my coffee quietly, letting her anxiety grow while keeping my voice calm and innocent whenever she looked at me. It was astonishing how quickly the tables had turned. The same sister who once held the household in her hands was now the one trembling under the weight of suspicion, and I was the calm observer, the silent architect of her unraveling. At dinner, Rachel's tension was palpable. She cut her food more forcefully than usual, slammed utensils against her plate, and laughed a little too loudly at her own jokes. Mom and Dad exchanged furtive glances, whispering occasionally under the table. I noticed Rachel's eyes darting toward me constantly, as though she feared I was about to reveal some hidden knowledge. I let her imagine the worst. Every false accusation, every imagined slight, played perfectly into the narrative I was shaping. The cracks I had nurtured were widening, and her control over our parents' perception was slipping. Later that evening, Rachel confronted me in the hallway. "Lauren, what are you doing?" she hissed, her voice trembling with frustration. "Why are you always lurking, always judging? What have you told them?" I tilted my head, letting a faint smile curl on my lips. "Nothing," I said softly, deliberately slow. "I just want everyone to see things clearly." "Isn't that fair?" Her lips pressed together, her eyes narrowing, and I knew she sensed my advantage. She couldn't prove it, but she could feel it, and that fear was intoxicating. I realized in that moment that the game had changed. I was no longer the one struggling for acknowledgement. I was the one controlling the flow of information, controlling perception, controlling the narrative. Rachel's every move now betrayed her anxiety, her insecurity, and her desperation to maintain an image that no longer fit. And soon, the letter, the one proof of her true intentions, would enter the stage at exactly the right moment, shattering the fragile illusion she had built over years of manipulation. As I lay awake that night, I could hear Rachel's muffled sobs from her room. The sound was small, but it reverberated like a victory bell in my chest. For the first time, I felt the satisfaction of quiet triumph, the power of patience and subtlety. Yet beneath it all, I knew the final act was still to come, the confrontation that would leave no room for excuses, no chance to hide behind arrogance or charm. And when that day arrived, the family would see the sister they had idolized for years for who she truly was, and I would finally reclaim my place, not with anger or vengeance alone, but with undeniable truth. The next family dinner was quiet, but the tension in the air was almost electric. Rachel sat across from me, her eyes flicking nervously between me and Mom, as if she expected me to strike at any moment. I took my seat calmly, holding my fork loosely, letting my silence speak volumes. Every glance I threw her way was calculated, just enough to make her shift uncomfortably. The golden mask she wore had begun to crack, and I intended to widen that fracture carefully, without appearing aggressive or vindictive. I began casually, asking Mom about organizing the garage, something Rachel had refused to help with weeks before. Rachel's face twitched at the mention, a small imperfection in her otherwise polished demeanor. Mom's brow furrowed slightly, as if wondering why her golden child had reacted that way. I added a few details, subtly hinting at Rachel's repeated laziness and selfishness, framing it in a neutral tone. I watched my parents' expressions carefully, noting each flicker of doubt, each hesitation, each pause where they searched for justification in her behavior. Rachel's eyes narrowed. "Lauren, what are you implying?" she asked sharply, her voice laced with irritation and fear. I tilted my head slightly, feigning innocence. "Nothing," I said softly, letting the word hang in the air. "I just think it's strange how some people's actions don't match what they expect from others. Isn't it odd how easily someone can manipulate perceptions without anyone noticing?" Her hands clenched on the table, and I could see her pulse racing. The first seeds of doubt were taking root in my parents' minds. Mom's lips pursed, a telltale sign of internal conflict. Dad's eyes narrowed thoughtfully, and I knew they were starting to question Rachel's version of events. That alone was exhilarating, but I didn't let my excitement show. I continued, sprinkling in small examples, tiny contradictions Rachel had created over time. I never called her a liar directly, never accused her of betrayal outright. I simply allowed the truth to unfold naturally, letting my parents fill in the blanks themselves. The power of subtlety was intoxicating. Rachel's attempts to regain control were almost comical. She laughed nervously, tried to redirect the conversation, and even offered half-hearted explanations for her previous behavior. But the damage was done. My parents' eyes no longer saw her as infallible. Every forced smile, every small slip, only reinforced the reality that they were beginning to question the child they had always believed was perfect. And I knew it. Once the doubt had settled in, the next step would be irreversible. By the time dessert arrived, Rachel's composure had all but crumbled. I sipped my tea, careful to appear detached, as Mom quietly whispered to Dad, her words soft but pointed. Rachel's face turned pale, her lips trembling slightly. For the first time in years, the balance of power had shifted. I wasn't merely the overlooked sister anymore. I was the one holding the evidence of truth, guiding my parents toward seeing Rachel for who she really was. And the final revelation, when it came, would leave no escape. I spent the following days quietly preparing, my heart hammering with anticipation. The letter rested safely in my drawer, hidden among papers my parents wouldn't suspect. Yet its presence was electric, a weighty promise of revelation. Every interaction with Rachel became a careful dance. I asked neutral questions, made casual remarks, all designed to elicit slips from her, to let her paranoia grow while I remained calm and unassuming. The more anxious she became, the more confident I felt, knowing that the moment of truth was nearly within reach. Rachel, oblivious to my plan, grew increasingly tense. She double-checked her words, softened her tone, and yet small cracks still appeared. Micro-expressions, fleeting tremors in her voice, slight hesitations that gave her away. I watched, noting every detail, every unguarded glance. Even Dad noticed her unease and shot her subtle questioning looks, while Mom's expressions carried a mixture of concern and confusion. My patience was paying off. Soon, the carefully constructed facade that Rachel had maintained for years, would crumble under the weight of undeniable proof. I decided the confrontation needed to be public, in a controlled environment where my parents could witness the truth for themselves. Waiting for the next family dinner, I prepared mentally, rehearsing what I would say and how I would present the evidence without giving Rachel the chance to manipulate the narrative. Every word mattered. Every gesture was deliberate. I was not acting out of cruelty. I was claiming justice for myself, reclaiming the years of being dismissed and overlooked. The line between vindication and exposition was thin, but I walked it with precision. When the evening arrived, the tension was palpable. Rachel sat nervously across the table, her fingers twisting the napkin under her hands. Dad's brow was furrowed. Mom's gaze shifted between the two of us, sensing that something critical was about to unfold. I let a few moments pass, observing Rachel's reaction, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably. Finally, I reached into my bag and extracted the envelope, holding it casually on the table. Her eyes widened ever so slightly, a flicker of fear passing through her carefully controlled expression. I placed the envelope in front of my parents. "There's something you should see," I said, my voice calm and deliberate. Rachel's protests were immediate, but I ignored them, letting Mom and Dad pick up the papers and read. Her carefully crafted lies, her selfish manipulation, and the ways she had tried to rewrite history were all laid bare in black and white. I watched the disbelief, the shock, and the dawning comprehension in my parents' faces. Rachel's protests turned to stammering, her once dominant confidence crumbling into panic as the evidence confronted her. By the end of the evening, Rachel sat in stunned silence, her mouth opening and closing, but no words emerging. My parents looked at her differently, their expressions a mix of disappointment, sorrow, and awakening clarity. For the first time, the balance of power had shifted completely. I felt a mixture of relief and triumph, tempered by empathy for the sister who had tried to dominate everyone's perceptions. But in that moment, justice and truth had prevailed. I had reclaimed my voice, my dignity, and most importantly, my rightful place in my family's eyes. The morning after the confrontation, the house felt different, almost fragile in its new tension. Rachel barely spoke, retreating to her room with quiet, defeated steps, the weight of the evidence pressing down on her. Mom and Dad moved cautiously around each other, careful not to reignite old arguments, but unable to ignore the truth they now carried. I stayed in the kitchen, quietly preparing breakfast, letting the silence settle like a thin veil over our fractured family. Even the air seemed heavy with the realization that nothing could go back to the way it was before. Mom approached me first, her eyes soft and a little tired. "Lauren," she whispered, I never knew." I nodded, feeling the sting of years of misunderstanding and neglect. "It's not your fault, Mom. None of it is," I said, my voice steady, yet gentle. She reached out, squeezing my hand as if anchoring herself to the reality we now shared. Dad lingered behind her, uncertain, watching me with a mixture of admiration and regret. For the first time, I felt the balance shift, not just in my favor, but in the possibility of real understanding between us. Rachel remained a ghost in the background, her presence a quiet reminder of the consequences of deceit. She avoided eye contact and spoke only when spoken to, but her anger simmered beneath the surface, a storm contained by embarrassment and recognition of her loss. I didn't gloat or press further. The letter had done all the work for me. Instead, I focused on rebuilding the family's trust in me, slowly, with patience and consistency. The house, once ruled by Rachel's manipulation, was finally becoming a place where honesty and accountability mattered. The next few weeks were a mixture of awkwardness and tentative rebuilding. My parents checked in with me more than ever, asking my opinions, valuing my perspective, and even joking softly about the chaos Rachel had caused. I realized that my quiet strategy had not only exposed the truth, but also forced a reevaluation of family dynamics. Rachel, though humiliated, began to show small signs of reflection, moments of vulnerability that were carefully hidden under layers of defensiveness. It was strange to see her as human, rather than a perfect antagonist, and I found myself feeling a complicated blend of pity and triumph. Family gatherings after the confrontation were cautious, but a subtle change was undeniable. Conversations included me naturally, no longer dominated by Rachel's commentary or dismissals. Mom smiled more freely in my presence, Dad nodded when I spoke, and even Rachel's defiance softened slightly. tempered by the knowledge that her actions were no longer invisible. I realized that the battle had never been about punishment alone. It had been about reclaiming my voice, asserting my presence, and demonstrating that truth and integrity mattered more than appearances. By the time a month had passed, I felt a quiet victory settling into the rhythm of daily life. Rachel's power had been diminished, yes, but the family itself was changing in ways that felt more important than triumph over a sibling. There was space now for empathy, for recognition of mistakes, and for growth that didn't require manipulation or deceit. I finally understood that the confrontation had not only revealed Rachel's lies, but also forced all of us to face our own roles in enabling them. And in that reflection, I discovered something far more meaningful than revenge, a chance for genuine family connection, built on truth rather than performance. The weeks that followed brought a new rhythm to our home, one defined by careful honesty and cautious optimism. Mom began asking me for advice on family matters, something she had rarely done before. Dad, once silent and distant, sought my perspective, listening intently as I shared my thoughts. Even Rachel, though still distant, had begun leaving small notes apologizing for minor grievances, a sign that the first cracks of humility were forming. I watched all of this quietly, allowing myself to savor the subtle victories without arrogance. It felt like walking through a garden after a long winter, everything fragile, tentative, yet alive. One evening, Mom pulled me aside while Rachel was out, her hands trembling slightly as she held mine. "Lauren," she said softly, "I can't tell you how sorry I am for overlooking you all these years. You've grown into someone I'm so proud of." The sincerity in her voice made my chest ache, a mixture of relief and lingering pain washing over me. I squeezed her hands in return, grateful for her acknowledgement. "Thank you, Mom," I whispered. "It means more than you know." The years of feeling invisible, of being underestimated, seemed to fade just a little in that moment. Rachel's slow transformation was harder to watch because it was uneven and filled with setbacks. There were days when she snapped, lashing out as though forgetting everything she had learned. But there were also moments, small, quiet ones, when she asked for help, shared a laugh, or admitted a mistake without trying to deflect. Those moments reminded me that beneath her manipulative layers, a human being still existed, capable of growth if she chose to accept it. It wasn't easy to forgive, but it was easier to understand. I started spending more time with my parents alone, separate from the tension Rachel carried. We cooked together, shared stories from the past, and discussed plans for the future. With every conversation, my voice grew stronger, more confident, no longer overshadowed by Rachel's domineering personality. I realized that reclaiming my place in the family didn't require humiliation or vengeance. It required presence, patience, and courage. Slowly, I was becoming the person I had always wanted to be, recognized, respected, and valued for who I truly was. The family dynamic shifted further during a casual weekend gathering. Rachel attempted her old tactics of attention-seeking, but my parents no longer indulged her as before. Instead, they redirected the conversation, acknowledged my contributions, and subtly highlighted my efforts and achievements. Rachel's surprise was evident, her frustration tempered by the realization that her influence had diminished. I felt a strange satisfaction, not cruelty, but justice in its quietest form. The house, once ruled by manipulation and favoritism, was finally becoming a space for fairness and authentic relationships. By the end of the month, I could see subtle signs of real change in Rachel. She was hesitant, still cautious, but willing to engage in conversations without deflection or deceit. Mom and Dad acknowledged the progress, treating her with the same patient guidance they had extended to me. I felt a cautious hope that one day, she might truly understand the consequences of her past actions and embrace the possibility of redemption. And in that hope, I found a sense of peace that went beyond victory. It was the beginning of a family healing that we had all long needed. The months that followed brought a quiet stability to our family, one I had never imagined possible. Rachel still had her moments of stubbornness and pride, but the power dynamics had shifted, and I no longer felt invisible or overshadowed. Mom and Dad treated me as an equal, valuing my opinions and acknowledging my contributions in ways that had once seemed impossible. Even Rachel, though still learning humility, was beginning to understand the value of honesty. I watched it all quietly, a mixture of relief and cautious hope settling into my chest. Then, one evening, I discovered something that shook me more than any confrontation or letter ever could. While cleaning out the shared storage closet, I stumbled upon a box labeled with my name, hidden there by my parents years ago. Inside were the keys to the car I had dreamed of as a teenager, the very one Rachel had received instead. Alongside them was a note from my parents, explaining that they had wanted to surprise me once I returned home for good, a secret they had kept even from Rachel. I felt a rush of emotions, validation, disbelief, and an unexpected warmth. Holding the keys in my hands, I realized that the battles, the resentment, and the years of feeling undervalued had all led to this moment. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about reclaiming my rightful place in a family that had always loved me, even if imperfectly. Rachel, if she noticed my discovery, said nothing, yet the subtle shift in her demeanor told me she understood. The final twist wasn't about punishment. It was about recognition, acknowledgement, and the long-awaited balancing of scales. I drove the car the next morning, feeling a mix of nostalgia and triumph. Each turn of the wheel reminded me of the journey I had endured, the manipulation, the heartbreak, the strategies I had used to reclaim my voice. Yet with each mile, I felt the tension of the past slipping away, leaving room for a future unburdened by resentment. I realized that the confrontation with Rachel, the careful navigation of family dynamics, and even the patience I had exercised were all part of a larger lesson, the importance of standing up for oneself without losing compassion. The family gatherings that followed were warmer, more authentic, and filled with laughter untainted by the old rivalries. Rachel had begun to show glimpses of genuine remorse and even gratitude for the boundaries I had set. Mom and Dad, finally aware of the depth of their previous oversights, treated each of us with a fairness that felt revolutionary. For the first time, I felt fully integrated into the family's rhythm, not as a passive participant, but as someone whose presence mattered. And yet, the hidden keys reminded me that love, sometimes, comes quietly and unexpectedly. Sitting in the driveway that evening, the car gleaming under the soft light of dusk, I understood the full weight of my journey. It had been filled with deception, rivalry, and moments of profound hurt, yet it had also revealed resilience, courage, and the subtle power of truth. I thought of Rachel, of my parents, and of myself, of how far we had come, and of how much further we could go if honesty and patience remained our guides. The twist, the revelation of the hidden keys, symbolized everything, that sometimes the rewards we long for are not taken. They are patiently waiting, hidden until we are ready to claim them. And in that quiet, reflective moment, I felt the deep satisfaction of a story finally, beautifully resolved.